Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Opapari, and this is the Songwriters on Process podcast. Since 2010, I've been interviewing songwriters about their writing process. And on this podcast, we go deep, deep, deep into the writing process, far deeper than the usual. Do you start with the lyrics or the music question? By way of background, I have a PhD in English literature, and I'm a prose writer myself. I'm not a songwriter. In fact, I've never written a song in my life. But my goal has always been to treat songwriters the same way that we treat prose writers and poets, just as writers, plain and simple. And I've always been interested in the writing process. This is an intelligent conversation between two writers. And on this podcast, like I said, we go deep into the process. We talk about rituals, the seeds of inspiration, the role of movement on the process, writer's block, the revision process, pens, pencils, types of paper, and of course, we talk about books. You can find all the archived interviews on the Songwriters on Podcast website and across all streaming platforms. And with that, let's dive into this week's episode. And today on the podcast, we have Jake Duzsik from Health. But first, a shameless plug, because if you are listening to this podcast and you're a fan of Health, you also may be a fan of Lamb of God. The two bands have collaborated before, and a few months ago, Health put out a remix of the Lamb of God song Laid to Rest. So, a few months ago, I co-authored a rock memoir called Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir by Mark Morton with Ben Opapari. That is me, Ben. Mark is a good friend of mine. He is a guitarist in the band Lamb of God, and we had a crazy idea a couple of years ago to write his life story. So that came out, I believe, in June, maybe, on Hachette Books. It is available everywhere. I will have a link in the description to buy it. It's a great book. I'm biased, but it really is. It's not your typical rock memoir. It's far deeper than that. Anyway, again, it is called Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir by Mark Morton with Ben Opapari. So buy that. Now back to the podcast. I have a list here of authors that Jake mentioned during the podcast. I mean, I have a PhD in English literature. I consider myself a pretty well-read guy, but this felt like one of my graduate seminars back when I was getting my PhD. To say that Jake is well-read is a colossal understatement. So I have a list here. I'm sure there's probably more I missed. Pascal, T.S. Eliot, Blake, Joan Didion, Kurt Vonnegut, Truman Capote, Oscar Wilde, Camus, Cormac McCarthy, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Thomas Pynchon. We talked about postmodern prose. I'm sure there are others in there, but my God, the guy reads all the time. Blew me away with all of those references. It shouldn't surprise me. I mean, songwriters are, for the most part, pretty well read, but I don't know that I've heard this many names mentioned in a podcast would made this a really fun conversation. We didn't talk too much about process. We did a little bit. I love when he mentioned he went through one of his anti-shorts phases where Jake said that, real writers don't write wearing shorts. They wear writing clothes. They dress up to write. So he was doing that briefly. He felt like it was beneath him to wear shorts when he wrote. I think he's given that up since. But this was a lot about the roots of creativity, why we write, the deep, deep reasons why we write. And so I really enjoyed talking about this with Jake. So check this out. This is one of my favorites. Really love this conversation. Don't forget, shameless plug, my book, Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir by Mark Morton with Ben Opapari, out now. But also listen to this podcast with Jake Duzsik from Health. All right, so we have 4 kids. You're a parent also. And I find that when I have all the time in the world, it's harder for me to create. I find that being a parent and having responsibilities actually makes me much more disciplined and effective as a writer because I don't have a lot of time. So, as a parent, as someone with not all the time in the world, do you find that you get more done because you are under time constraints?
It's really interesting that you said that, because that has been exactly my experience. And it's been something that I've been occasionally hard pressed to communicate to. Most of my friends are in the music industry, um, are either starting to have kids or just don't have kids. They're either broke or like lifer narcissist weirdos that can't really figure out how to like partition not being able to focus on themselves, which is an understandable predilection in our business. But yeah, I became incredibly more prolific and focused as a writer after having had a child and having zero time to myself. And I think that largely it is a function of like, I don't have any fucking time to waste. I just don't. My partner and I are lucky if we can watch a 30-minute episode of The Bear after my son goes to bed, who's like, his new thing is not wanting to go to bed, So I just really, the flip side of that coin is that I have no hobbies anymore. I don't have any time to devote to anything else other than parenting or writing music. And then obviously the other obligations of my job, which is touring and festivals and things like that, keep the lights on. So it's really been a technicolor focus of my two responsibilities and crosses to bear in life, which is like being a dad and working on music. And in that way, it was very, I don't know, liberating is the right word, but just what's the line from Fight Club? I hate to quote Fight Club, but it just leapt into my mind where it's like the ability to truly let that which does not matter slide,
Yeah.
just all the superfluous crap that you might worry about. Or, I mean, there are some things that detrimentally go by the wayside, like exercise and maybe socializing more with your friends, things like that I wish I had a little bit more time for. But on the other side, it's really brought right into the center of the frame what's most important to me. And yeah, like you said, mostly I have become so much more effective at my craft because I just can't fuck around doing anything else.
I think that when COVID first happened, that was the thought was of all the time in the world to create because I'm not going anywhere. And then a year later, no one had done anything because they had all the time in the world. Um, and I think it's a little bit of what we're talking about is that when the pressure is on, you'll get stuff done. I mean, I think we live in the DC area, but I go to New York all the time for work, and I'll get more done on a 2.5 hour train ride than if I sat here for 2.5 hours because I know that when we pull into Penn Station, I have to put my laptop away. That's why airplanes, I think, can be incredibly productive because at some point you've got to stop. But if I said to you, write for an hour and a half, you may not get as much done. But if I said to you, your son's going to be up in an hour and a half, right? You'll probably get a lot more done.
Yeah. I mean, definitely was my experience as well that a lot of the people that I knew during the pandemic, I mean, I had an infant. My son was born 1/1/2020, so he's the Antichrist.
Right.
And, uh, you know, 3 months after he was born, which is right about the time that his mom and I could take a breath of air and realize that we could keep him alive and knew how to function. And we're ready to start having friends over and taking him out, like where we're not functioning on 1 hour of sleep a night was right when everything locked down and nobody could come over. We couldn't go anywhere. Um, and so it was interesting for me observing other people I knew. There was the initial shock phase where everyone's just on the internet, freaked out. Am I going to be able to wipe my butt? Can I get food? All these, crazy things that we hadn't experienced before. But I have a lot of musician friends that, as they would have put it, had writer's block for a
Yeah.
year and just video games and just sitting and stewing in their own juices. And that was not my experience at all. I think also because I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but it was a very traumatic time for me emotionally. I think like just the shock of becoming a dad, um, at simultaneously dealing with this Camus-esque mass confrontation of mortality and uncertainty and how fragile life is, like all in one moment. And so it wasn't even just that I had more time or had more focus, but also from because a lot of my writing is self-directed. I mean, I knew I was writing for my band, and we were writing these collaborative albums, but it's not like I have a deadline and it's a word count, and I'm like, here's my mandate. So much of it can also be cathartic and therapeutic, and I found even with the oppressive weight of lack of sleep and anxiety and depression. Is my job ever going to come back? Is my son going to get sick? And we had no um, history of caring for an infant, all these different things. It was more important for me to write than at any other time in my life. To just, and I hate the cliches of like, oh, I had to process my grief through art, but most cliches are fucking true for
Yeah.
a reason. And it really became unquestionable to me that if I had not had that outlet, and I'm also a recovering alcoholic, so it's like being stuck in my house, fucking Eraserhead, Screaming Baby, uh, cyberpunk dystopian future, virus terror through the. It was a.
Yeah.
Luckily for me, it wasn't a touch and go time where I felt like my sobriety was really in jeopardy, but it wasn't. It was probably always there in the background.
Yeah.
And so being able to put him to bed, and even if I really needed to sleep, it was like my subconscious knew, no, you need 2 hours to just get something out.
So are you more effective writing I think I know the answer to this, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. Are you more effective writing at the extremes of emotions or in the middle? I mean, some songwriters, again, I'm not a songwriter, I'm a prose writer, but some songwriters tell me that when they are too euphoric or too down, that's actually more difficult to write from. And then they need that to kind of come down from those things. So, are extremes easier to you? Are those extreme emotions easy places to write from in the moment, like immediately?
The more, and I try to be really careful about this, and I just did a podcast or an interview in Australia that was about music and mental health. And, I try to be careful about glorifying that sort of Rimbaud, Baudelaire, tortured artist um, fallacy that the only way to create good art is
Yeah.
to be deranged or fucked up. And I think that's completely untrue. But I think that one thing that you're pointing out is it really does vary from individual to individual. And unfortunately for me, and the type of music and art that I make, um, I feel like I am more creatively effective when I'm at extremes. Definitely. And that's like it depends on what I'm doing. Like if I needed to write something, like I'm pretty hands on. So if the label wants us to do sort of a one sheet for our band's bio, I have like a good friend at the LA Times who like helps us with that kind of stuff, but I'm very involved. I don't need to be at emotional extremity to edit and proofread and things like that, to do that kind of work.
Yeah.
But to do the kind of work that I do in my band, I could be at a different. The honest answer is that especially the last few years of my life have been some of the most emotionally difficult years that I've had. And I feel like, I mean, I come from an older school of like not wanting to, I don't want to say we're doing our best work, but I'm hearing that from other people. And I think that part of that is because I'm really unhappy. And
Yeah.
it's like, it's just a raw nerve to tap into. And there's less fascia between the veil. You know what I mean? Like they're
Yeah.
just, and, and that's unfortunate that that's what my relationship to art is. And I don't think it's like that for everybody, but it is for me.
So you mentioned, I want to go back to the parenting thing. One more follow up to that is, do you find that not being exposed to external factors, I mean, I guess practically the environment outside, does that make it harder to create? I mean, I think there's this, um, I, this is not a discussion about COVID, but when people couldn't leave the house, what the hell are you going to write about? So do you think that you mentioned like you don't have those hobbies and things like that? And I'm curious if if it's harder to be creative if you practically don't have environmental stimuli.
Well, I kind of have, you know, a thematic loop in my writing, which is the same OCD loop in my brain, which is trying to process existence in the face of cosmic meaninglessness and grief and pain that is self-imposed by our own consciousness. So I'm never at a. Unfortunately, I've had that emotion on tap, so that I'm never at a loss for that subject matter, and it has turned out to be something that our fan base has really resonated with, and I think have increasingly resonated with in this sort of modern dystopian era that we're living in, where people are finding themselves increasingly unhappy and aware of that unhappiness. So that's sort of a self-contained, I'm not writing topical music or going out
Right.
and, and then one of the things of the last, but what I will say is during the pandemic, we did a two, we did a double album of collaborative music. Half of it had been finished before the pandemic started. And the virtue in that is that you're working with other artists and it sounds reductive, but one thing that I'd always say about process is you always read interviews, or if you're reading, I'm a student of the rock biography and just, I love music bios in general. And you'll always hear artists talking about like, I wanted to change things up and get out of my habits, my writing habits, my creative go-tos. And that's completely valid. And I resonate with the same thing, but there's that, it's the musical or creative adage of, wherever you go, there you are. You're never going to do anything that you aren't going to do. Even if you start listening to a bunch of new music to put yourself in a new headspace, and those things are all important, but we all have our aesthetic proclivities and our neurological arrangement when it comes to music. The way that you gravitate towards organizing those 12 tones, it's hard to get out of that, the pitfalls of just the way your own brain works. So even though we didn't have external stimuli, when you write 20 songs with 20 different artists, every single time it's a new experience because they're bringing they're going to do a thing that you cannot do.
Mm-hmm.
It's not even that you can't do it, because none of us, with the exception of doing a song with like a band like Lamb of God, where like Randy is a virtuosic player, mostly it's all just taste calls, especially in our band, you know? Or like we did a song with Nine Inch Nails. It's like Trent Reznor is not known for his virtuosic instrumental prowess. It's his musical vision, you know, and that is based on his own sensibilities. And, you know, you could listen to a band like Nine Inch Nails and then afterwards go to the major fifth and or the major third and be like, that sounds like Nine Inch Nails. It's not like some impossible thing to do. It's that instinct to do it that is unique to every band we worked with. Being able to draw from that, I think, kept us very much by osmosis in the conversation of not getting stuck without life to draw on, because it was by proxy, you know, we're sort of vicariously able to tap into, because it's not just that if I'm writing a song with someone else rather than my band, what they do is going to inform what I do. They can't exist without each other. So as a student of literature, sort of like it always stuck with me, T.S. Eliot's literary theory essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, and sort of this Ouroboros sort of thing that, you know, it's not just what has come before being connected to and responsible for what is being written in the present, but that what's being written in the present then inextricably alters the past, sort of thing. And this conversation that's going on. And I'm not trying to drop that as something. It's really always stuck with me that, you know, you're not writing in a vacuum, and being able to be connected to other music, I think, is so quintessentially important. So for us, the pandemic was we were just one of those bands that turned fucking lemons into lemonade on the small scale in that way, because I mean, you know, you can't, it's not 4D chess. We didn't plan that shit out. It just happened that it irrevocably changed our band forever, because writing that much music with that many different people just changes the way you think about music.
Yeah.
It makes you more open-minded. And coming off of that, we went into writing an LP, and I think that, and I want to give you time to ask questions, but while I'm on the narrative of it, part of writing collaborative music is it's pretty much impossible to give yourself mandates about what kind of song you want to write. You'll just kill it in the crib. It just doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, we're going to write a banger. We're going to write this kind of song. When you're corresponding with someone, or even if you're in the same room, it's just, that will denude the process of any validity in a weird way to try to shoehorn it. So you just try to write a song and have it be organic, because it's like a first date or something, you know, you kind of have to just feel it out and let it go where it's going to go. And that freeness of not putting too much pressure other than letting creative conversation transpire, we carried it over into our next record. And so in a strange way, we just put a lot less emphasis on what kind of songs are we trying to write. Is this going to be good for Spotify? Would it go on TikTok? Like, we just didn't give a fuck.
Yeah.
And I'm aware of the fact that, like, nobody really knows why the hell anything works. You know, you talk to record labels and they're like, if anybody knew why it worked, it would work all the time, like a light switch going on. It's not how it works. The zeitgeist and the court of public opinion and everything is this impossibly complex, algorithmic human thing. But I will say that from the sort of trite standpoint of, like, writing, being true to yourself, the record that we kind of put the least amount of onus on ourselves to do, other than just to just be ourselves, seems to be the most successful one. And there's something about that, you know, just like not worrying that much about what, And that doesn't mean it's not aesthetic rigor. That rigor is built in. It's just not that thing of wondering if a song's going to get, did you think this would get synced for a Netflix show? Or this sounds like it would be good for some shit that some Zoomers would put on their TikTok channel. Like, that stuff is just hard to fold into being creatively attuned to yourself.
So does that translate to the ritual of the process itself for you? I mean, I again, the stories I hear are from songwriters, but there are some who will, to take the pressure off it and to make it less precious. And I'm talking about the actual act of the writing, the actual process of the writing, will intentionally do things like write lyrics on the back of a utility bill. They will not use, you know, they'll use, in other words, like, they don't want to make it they don't want to make it precious, because if they do, there's more pressure. If that makes sense, you know, whether it comes to place where they write or anything like that. So with that ritual, then I guess and I'm talking about the actual act of writing. For example, like, are you a pen and paper person or a computer person when it comes to lyrics?
I prefer to put pen to paper. Maybe just out of more of the tactile relationship of it. You know, phones aren't the most sexy things to write things on, but I'll use the whole buffalo. I'll do what I got to do. Especially lately, it's more just been like, if I'm processing demos and I'm listening to them in my AirPods or something on a plane. Yeah, I do a lot of work in my car. So that's always been a place where, like, play demos in my car, listen, whether or not it's to an instrumental or to a demo that has scratch vocals, but I don't have set lyrics yet. And that could mean at a stoplight, I need to write down something on my phone before I forget it. You know, there's certain things. This is really funny. It's quite warm in Los Angeles. For a long time, I just had this thing. It's like, you know what? You can't write good music in shorts. It's just like, it's not a good, it's just like, it's not the right headspace for creating music to wear shorts. I mean, it's hard to imagine Beethoven in his little knickerbockers, like, humming. It's just, or like Faulkner finishing up Sound and the Fury, and he's like in his khakis with no socks on. Maybe Hemingway, because he was in Cuba or something. But as I've kind of like backed off on that. I used to have some ritualistic things, but I'm not. I also feel like we're pretty humble. Well, it's unhumble to say that you're humble, but I guess I'm not up my own ass enough, and I'm not quite eccentric enough to have a bunch of rituals that I need to sort of. I kind of am one of those. It's not to say that I don't believe in writer's block, but I do think that the sort of 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration, which is not necessarily valid in truly creative pursuits, depending on your disposition. But I really do think that if you want to be good or get somewhere, you got to work a lot, you know? So like the idea of like spending a year feeling like you don't know what to write about. I mean, even once you know what to write about, you don't know if you're going to get anything good. You got to put in those hours. So especially as I've gotten older, that's been a thing. If kids ask it, you know, and I don't know what to do. Like, how do you start a band? It's like, dude, who fucking knows now? Like, become a YouTube celebrity before you start a band. That would help. That's
Right.
what labels want. That's what record labels want now. They're like, do you have social media fame that can help us sell your record? Which is like, why do I need you then? But the one thing that I would say is there's just really no substitute for working a lot, you know?
Yeah. Well, I was going
And
to say, I had Anthony, I interviewed Anthony Dorr about 10 years ago. He wrote the book, All the Light We Cannot See, won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. So I asked him, about writer's block. He goes, I don't believe in writer's block. He called it a failure of courage. And that,
Yeah, and I'm a little bit more guarded to project onto other people my own feelings, and I think that's something that I become increasingly more aware of as I've gotten older. Is you just don't know what it's like to be inside someone's skin, and true empathy, as you kind of learn, is that that you have innate feelings that you can't always control. So I'm careful about saying what other people experience is a failure of some sort. But I do resonate with that sentiment in terms of I think that you do need to work if you
yeah,
want to get somewhere. And I think that part of what tends to happen when people get out of writer's block is not necessarily inspiration as much as getting over the block of putting in time, of being able to work on something. And one thing that I have become that's been sort of revolutionary to my life as a musician is trying to evade, if at all possible, the stasis, the like a cicada like gestational period that's imposed by the touring writing cycle in the music world. And it's so common that you work and you work and you work and you work and you finish a record. And right when you finish that record is probably when you're at the zenith of your creative prowess. It's when you understand the document that you've created the most, and you're most fluid in the studio, and you're most tuned into what you're doing. And then you're supposed to just fucking stop and go on tour for 2 years and just be exhausted, trying to sleep in hotel rooms, be jet lagged from coming back from Australia, not have any fucking time. And it kind of stopped. I mean, imagine like if you're a novelist or something, it's a tricky thing because you that's different than writing songs that are these shorter documents. But I've kind of become obsessed with this Black Sabbath paranoid idea of the record's done, but you should write one more song. So they're like, oh, okay, let's write a song. That song is Paranoid. And it's the biggest song
right.
they've ever They wrote it in like one day. But they don't get that song unless they try to write one more song. And it's after they finish their record. It's like it's when they're all the most in touch with what they're doing. And I had a record label, the guy who started our record label with his son, Tom Wally, who was like, which we've hardly had any interaction with him over the last several years, but he is sort of this scion of the recording business. And he was the head of A&R for Interscope, and he ran Warner Brothers for years. But he actually said this to me about right at the time when we first signed a contract with them. We were finishing a record, and he was like, oh, yeah, the record's great. It's really too bad you have to stop writing. And, we were like a noise band that came out of a scene where paying rent meant like grinding out fucking DIY tours and really like road dogging and being blue collar about it. And I've always been connected to that. And it sort of took me aback for a second. And the conversation that ensued is what we're having now is that, you really, it's unfortunate that we have to ask bands to stop writing right when they are in their groove creatively. And so since I had that kid, I've really just put a lot of pressure on us and on our management and on the label side of just continuing, because I feel like it's like fucking going to the gym or staying sober or doing whatever thing, eating healthy. The second that you let those routines flag, you're fucked.
Mm-hmm.
And then you are like, I'm going to go back to the gym. It's the same shit. It's about let's make no mistakes, creativity is still governed by all the same biological functions as the rest of our lives. It's still it's magical. It's more magical than any Harry Potter fucking Lord of the Rings shit. It's just we're habituated that you can just make sounds and elicit these profound emotional experiences of people, or write words on a page, and they can be the most transcendent experiences, but they still exist within the parameters of evolutionary biology. And as unknowable as some of those intangibles are, I really believe that keeping that fresh as part of how you live, it just, if you let that go away, that's where the writer's block comes from, is that you're getting away with staying in touch with, like if you do yoga every day, your core strength and your flexibility are going to be maintained, and you're at least maintaining this relationship. If you stop for a year and then you go in and try to do a bunch of back bends, like, you fucking hurt yourself. I feel like the same kind of thing happens for me creatively. If I get out of it, and the other issue for me is I have monomaniacal tendencies, so it's like, for a while I was rock climbing a lot. It was great. I was really progressing at rock climbing. I was not able to write music. I didn't have the bandwidth to do one thing. If I was climbing, it was like I was just fucking obsessing about climbing, training for climbing, fucking climbing 4 or 5 hours a day. And, I could be like, oh, now I'm going to go work on music. But my focus and my energy were going to something else. And I think but I also know people that are really good at partitioning. Like, I go to the gym, then I go do this and I work on music. But for me, it's very kind of like an all or nothing sort of relationship with things.
I mean, listen, I've had people on the podcast. I had Jerry Harrison from the Talking Heads on recently, Johnny Marr. Those people have been around for the longest, 40, 50 years, whatever. None of them have said, oh, I just kind of write when I feel like it. I mean, every one of them, the people have been around the longest, are always those who say, you got to write every day. It doesn't matter how bad it is. You got to do it every day, and you got to push through it. I don't think any of them ever said, yeah, I just write when I feel like it and when the mood strikes. They treat it as butt and seat. And that's, I think it's so funny, is that, if you talk to read any interview with a prose writer, a novelist, I don't think a novelist or a poet will ever say, yeah, just write when you feel like it. Like, for some reason, they have that discipline, but most songwriters don't feel that way.
I was actually just going to bring up that exact thing. There's a number of components or facets to music that make it sort of unique in that way, and this is obviously, I'm biased, but I feel like I had ambitions to be a writer, and of prose, of of journalism. Those are kind of but I ultimately found that while I felt I had a facility for writing and a great love of reading, I did not enjoy writing. I think it's really hard. And writing a book, writing a novel, writing a screenplay, even, I think is incredibly grueling and lonely work. And so I think that there is this thing that can happen with musicians, this spoiled factor of like, there's just, the sort of like a backtracking even further of the medium is the message kind of thing. It's like the medium is the process too. So, if you become like, I started playing guitar before I started doing anything else. It's like, I started playing guitar. It was just incredibly fun to play guitar and sit and noodle and like learn someone else's song and then just come up with your own melodies, and you could just fuck around, or you could just get a case of beer and hang out with your buddies and your band and start working on music. There is this element of working on music that can be so fun that it can unfortunately predispose you to not wanting to do the hard work when it's not fun. Whereas I think other creative pursuits, there's a familiarity that comes with the inborn labor of it. Of like, hey, I want to write a poem, or I want to write an article. It's like, that's fucking hard. It's just
Yeah.
like, it's hard work. You have to sit down or it's like, if you want to direct a movie, it's like, okay, well, enjoy your 15-hour days and you're just busting your ass and gutting it out, or edit a film. Like I have a lot of friends that are one of my best friends is like a very successful film and TV editor. And it's like, I look at the way he works, and since we were in our early 20s, he's had this just crazy work ethic that just has been like head down working. And that's how you make that shit. That's how you become proficient. And that's how you become a master. If you're going to, and most of that time I was like, I was just like getting fucked up and on tour and like having a lot of fun, and there's something to be said for that exuberance. I do think that there's something about music that does appeal to the lazier of us in the creative field. And I still just think it's the best thing. Not only is it more fun to do, but then when you're done, you get to go like play it live and it's different every single time. I mean, I can't imagine when you finish a book, you're like, oh, cool, the book's out.
Right.
So, but I think that some of those aspects of being a songwriter can spoil people. And so when it gets hard, they're like, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And I think that having that perspective, I think it's helpful for me. Parenthood is hugely instructive in that, because while parenthood is, I'm speaking from my own perspective. You have 4 kids, so you know much better than you're fucking crazy, by the way. But it is the most difficult thing I've ever done, and simultaneously the most gratifying. And so it's a 3rd dimension, 4 dimension thing when you try to explain to people why it's worthwhile to be a parent. It's like, oh yeah, your life's over. Like you're not going to have any time for anything, but it's like, I'm not going to be able to communicate to you it's like Pascal's wager or something. And it's like, you can't explain what they're going to gain to it, they're going to gain from it, because it's not measurable in binging Netflix shows.
Right.
Or like trying the new restaurant. It's like, yeah, you're going to have to just cede your life to another individual that you will never have been able to conceive that you could love someone that much. And then they'll do something like smile at you, and it'll be the most profound thing that has ever happened. So it's like,
yeah,
but I can't explain that, until you. Then I think that in certain ways, for some musicians, they start young and it's really fun, and then it maybe gets not so fun, and they're just like, oh man, I don't want to do that. you
right.
know? So
I was going to say, well, I've got a quote up here by Dorothy Parker, exactly what we're talking about. She said, and I think Dorothy Parker founded the New Yorker. She was, big in the 20s in that scene. She said, I hate writing. I love having written.
Yep. It's such and so the thing is, for me, or, like what Hemingway in his, he didn't attend, but the recorded speech for his Nobel Prize, I'd have to paraphrase it, but he basically said, a good writer does his work alone. And I think he also did, like, every day confronts eternity or the lack of it. And as he grows in stature, his loneliness lessens, and he does less and less valid work, basically. Yeah. That's fucking heavy shit, man. He used to pace around and then write a couple of lines on his mantelpiece. He wouldn't sit. And it's like, That's real different from Skinner ripping Freebird like in it's like there's just a language of music that is it's very fun.
I have a Hemingway quote up here, and this is speaking of the ritual. You write until you come to a place where you still have your juice and know what will happen next, and you stop and try to live through until the next day when you hit it again. You have started at 6 in the morning, say, and may go on until noon or be through before that. When you stop, you are as empty and at the same time never empty but filling. In other words, what he would do is he would stop at night when he knew he still had something left in the tank because he was terrified of starting the next day with nothing to say. And that
Yeah.
discipline of saying, like, okay, I know, like, I could see this through, but I'm going to wait because, man, there's nothing greater than waking up and not knowing what you're going to write about.
And you wonder about that, and I don't mean to turn this into being about literature, but it's just something that I've always marveled at is that obviously people like Hemingway or a lot of the great writers, like especially the writers that we have conflated with their excesses, like Hemingway or Thompson or Faulkner, um, sort of this male idea of excess. And I think that what really you really forget about, it's not just about what they had to say or how to say it, but just that fucking gene to work,
Mhm.
to just work your ass off. I mean, look at like Joan Didion writing The Year of Magical Thinking. Like after going through something like the discipline to process that unimaginably unpleasant to write thing. Um, that's so much of it, and it seems, and I know that I've met people, and I'm maybe perhaps more grounded, or you and I are more grounded in that way. I know that there are writers that music or otherwise are much more, for lack of a better word, eccentric, and they do get into these sort of either meditatively aided or pharmacologically aided sort of states to write. And but that's just not been my experience. It's really, as we sort of discussed earlier, kind of, for me at least, in the content of what I write, connecting with that raw nerve of getting close to something that's maybe not the easiest thing to write about. That's for me lyrical, but just doing the work. The great thing that I find about just writing melodies is that it is simultaneously very fun and almost immediately rewarding. Because you got to, I don't know if you make music, but when you discover something melodic that feels special or or resonates with you, there's an immediate elation.
Mhm.
Even before, and this could be very early on in the process. So, and then that's on loop in your head, and you're trying to like, like as Stephen King said in On Writing, when he's unearthing an existing plot line like a paleontologist. It's exactly the same when it comes to a melody. You're just trying to, once it's sort of there, it's not about finding the right notes in terms of inventing them. It's like they're there. I just have to like do the crossword and figure out, because now I have it. It's like it's in C minor. It's not going to go out of C minor. There's only so many notes I can use in that key. What's the order? I know that I know what they are. I just haven't heard it yet. I have to keep rearranging. And so, the same way that you're unlocking a puzzle, there's this immediate endorphin rush. And that part of the writing process as a musician, I think, is totally different. And I'd go one further, is it then when I get into the act of finalizing lyrics, it's pretty fucking excruciating. It goes back to that thing of writing prose is hard, because you're like, what the fuck am I trying to say? Like, okay, that sounds good. The vowels work. Syllabically, it's right. Doesn't quite rhyme. Is that okay? Does it need to rhyme? Okay, that line sounds better, but it's not as clear. Is it more important to be clear or better to have it aesthetically like it just becomes sort of painstaking. And I just really feel like there's this incredible virtue that's afforded. And I think that's coded into music because it's also true of how we listen to music.
Yeah.
So you can, the greatest books that you love in your life, most fucking people don't even read anymore. But if they do, they seldom read a book more than once. Whereas your favorite song, you will listen to thousands of times in your life. And I think that there's something about how our biology is interacting with that on a neurological level that is also borne out in the creative process as well. It's harder to than it is. It's harder to read a great novel than it is to listen to a great 3-minute song. It demands a lot more, and the payoff is different and in certain ways deeper. And I think that is reflected in the writing process as well.
You alluded to this a few minutes ago, and I was looking. There's a book, and I have it on my Kindle here. It's called "The Trip to Echo Spring," and it came out about 5 or 10 years ago. And the woman's name, I should probably say who it is. But the woman's name is Olivia Lang, and I think she's a professor. And each chapter is about a different author, and if Faulkner's in there, Cheever's in there. Hemingway's in there, I think, but each chapter is a different author, and it's about, it's very clear that the detriment, how the drinking for each chapter is a different author, and it's about how alcohol basically completely ruined their careers. And it doesn't make them better writers. It doesn't. I mean, my PhD is in 20th century American theater playwrights. So Tennessee Williams, Eugene O'Neill.
O'Neill, yeah.
There's a very, very direct through line. Like once that took over Williams, I mean, his last plays are borderline unreadable. And I'll never forget, like my uncle tells the story. My uncle used to live in Key West when Williams lived there. This is like in the 70s. And my uncle was buying beer at a 7-Eleven. It was like 2 a.m. And Tennessee Williams walked in, could barely stand up. His glasses are basically like this, can't even talk, slurring his words. And it was like, my God, could you imagine? This is the guy that wrote fucking Streetcar Named Desire. And he's in a 7-Eleven, cannot even talk. And that was so for it's a great book because it's about no, you don't become better as you drink. At least for these kind of writers, it was a very clear through line that they kind of fell apart.
I mean, it's not dissimilar at all to music. We have this, and one thing that's magical about the internet for young kids, creating everything into this, like the analogy I always derive is it's like the Tralfamadorians in Slaughterhouse-Five who perceive time non-linearly.
Right.
Kids perceive time non-linearly now because all eras, like when I was growing up, everything was tribal, like, oh, you like skateboarding and punk rock? It's like, can't be a goth, even though they're both roots of the same fucking family tree. Now it's like everything just occurs in the ether simultaneously. And so that has at least disabused some of this notion of only good music is created by young people and sort of putting that. But there is this thing where like, oh, then they got sober and they got shitty. It's like, no, they had an explosion of creativity connected to their youth that coincided with drug use that becomes unmanageable once you get older, which is what happens in the guy that works at the fucking post office just as much as the guy who's like a writer,
Yeah.
Like your biology can sort of juggle the two things until the addiction takes over your physiology. There's few wordsmiths more formidable in their just raw talent of, like, I would argue that Capote is like the American version of Oscar Wilde in terms of his snappiness. And, you know, when he died, they autopsied his brain and it had shrunk to like fucking it was a third of his brain matter had wasted away from wet brain, basically.
Yeah.
Just drank this incredible specimen of thinking into oblivion. And that, there's very few. The one example that leaps to mind, because my youthful obsessions with it, and I know we have to wrap up soon here, but the one writer whose process that stands out to me is Bukowski, because there's a freeness with the way that he wrote and sort of a lack of like that gutter poet kind of thing. He's not like Hemingway, like sitting there going like, I need to write the most important novel.
Right.
That's been written right now.
Pressure.
Or Faulkner going like, okay, I'm taking a position as a firehouse night watchman so I can write a tour de force. Bukowski's just like, I'm a shitbag and I want to express some things. So it's like his process of writing Post Office, his first novel was, which he wrote in about 2 weeks. He would drink a fifth of whiskey and a half a case of beer every night. And he would write between 20 to 30 pages, shit-faced, and be able to keep about 10. So he's still writing 10 fucking pages a day. And that novel is hilarious. And he was sort of able to maintain this sort of drunken, I'm not saying that he's one of those unique ones where you're like, there was a symbiosis. So like Faulkner, for example, from what I've read, and Hemingway, they didn't write drunk. It was like Hemingway would do his mug full of orange juice and beer in the morning to try to like process the hangover. And Faulkner, he would be on these benders that prevented him from writing, and then he'd have to straighten out. But I think that and Lord Thompson in the end of his life was like, Rolling Stone couldn't get one article out of him in a year because it was like he had to create a chaos web of all this shit and be on all this speed up for days to try to finish. But there's always exceptions to these rules, and it kind of feels like Bukowski was one of those. And unfortunately, that was an artist that I became very obsessed with when I was very young. And it was really to my detriment.
So let's end with this then. So are you, when it comes to, you're obviously a voracious reader. Are you a genre person, an author person? I'll share my habits. So when I finish a book, my immediate impulse is I want to read something by someone else because I don't want that voice in my head. So I rarely read 2 books in a row by the same author. But I'd love to know like are you a genre person, author person, or neither?
I am definitely an author person, not a genre person. I am the opposite of what you just said. It comes down to the monomania thing. So like if I started, I read Blood Meridian and then I read every Cormac McCarthy book, like every one of them. Kind of like I'm inhabiting this space. And I would say McCarthy is one of the few authors where I have, like I've read Blood Meridian maybe 4 times, which I've never done with another book. Which I know sounds kind of fucking crazy, but there's just something about the subject matter and the prose. Really, it's the prose. I don't know that there's been another writer of prose in American literature that has had the same effect on me. So I definitely am not a genre person. Like I've had issues in my life with reading in terms of, I've not let myself read very much popular literature because I've just felt so much pressure to try to ingest works that are important. And that I think has led to lapses in my reading habits in terms of fiction. Like there was a period of time where all I read was fiction when I was young. And then I studied literature and, would have been a dream of mine to be a writer until I realized how unpleasant it was. And then I had like almost a decade long period where I just read nonfiction. I don't know what happened. And that would be, it's all subject oriented. So it's like, I started reading about the Civil War and then I read nothing but books about the Civil War for 4 years, and then I sort of put that away and I start reading something else. The one through line is I can always read music biographies.
Yeah.
Because it's just so fascinating to me. But yeah, if I have a proclivity, like a real central through line, it's like those just heavy fucking, like The Plague by Camus, For Whom the Bell Tolls, Blood Meridian, 100 Years of Solitude, like these kind of like very existentially weighted books have been and I thought about this in terms of like trying to write something. And I don't know if you ever read On Writing by Stephen King.
Yeah.
I'm not a big Stephen King guy because I always felt like, I'm not going to read the biggest, like I have more serious. It's a fucking fascinating book. But one thing that I thought, and it's so, maybe we can end on this, is he's not saying write what you know. What he's saying is like, don't fucking try to pretend to be something you're not. If you read mystery novels, don't try to write a work of postmodern prose like Thomas Pynchon because you think it'll impress your wife's friends. It's not going to work. If you read Pynchon novels, don't try to write a mystery novel because you think that it'll be commercial. Like it won't fucking work.
Yeah.
I think that's very true in almost every creative pursuit. Is if you're not going to resonate, you can do things as a journeyman, but that's different from trying to express yourself. And that's one of the few virtues of getting older, I feel, is not having to delude yourself about the things that you're going to do. Like, I don't have to pretend I'm going to get good at home improvement or that I'm going to take up gardening. I'm like, I don't fucking like that shit. I'm not going to do it. I'm never going to be good at it. But when I was younger, it's like, I should do this. And, I think that creatively, I have a similar thing. I'm interested to push myself, but doing something disingenuine, I know will not yield me any useful results.
And that's it for today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget my book, Desolation, a heavy metal memoir by Mark Morton with Benno Papari, that is me, comes out June 25th on Hachette Books. Mark is a good friend of mine. He is one of the guitarists in the band Lamb of God, and this is his memoir. It's a damn good book, if I do say so myself. But again, that book is out June 25th on Hachette Books. You can pre-order it now everywhere, your favorite online bookstore. So be sure to do that. The site, Songwriters on Podcast, contains all of the archived episodes of the podcast. Of course, you can find them on all streaming platforms as well, but they're also on the site. I only have had the podcast for about, I don't think even 2 years. Before that, all of the interviews were transcribed, and that took a lot of work. And that's why I started the podcast. So if you want to read the interviews that I did before the podcast, they are on Songwriters on Podcast as well. There are about 200 of them going back to 2010. So check those out. If you want to get a hold of me, Ben at songwritersonprocess.com, or fill out a form on the website. I'm here for your questions, your complaints, your concerns, or your interview suggestions. I'd love getting those as well. So hit me up. I will try to respond. So that's it, everyone. Have a great day and see you next time.